Thank you, everybody. Can everybody hear me over this? That's what I'm sure, because I can't really hear myself, which is probably a good thing. Well, thank you, Alan, for having me come down from Sacramento and get out of the bubble that is Sacramento. It's always nice to come here and speak to all of you. So Alan was telling me this class is a mix of years and a mix of majors. I just want to kind of take a survey of see who I'm speaking to. How many of you are poli-sci majors in here? Oh, I love it. I mean, no offense to the rest of you. I'm just saying. I'm a poli-sci major. I graduated from Sacramento State. Not as good as a school as this one, but still, it's a school. And I got a bachelor's degree in poli-sci and one in history. And then history majors. Who else is a history major in here? Raise your hand. Not as many, right? Okay. How many of you want to work in politics after you graduate? Okay, I'll try to talk you out of that today. I'm just kidding. And then how many of you are blindly ambitious and want to run for office? There we go. All right. The rare ones. Good. Okay, so I'll give you a little background. I graduated from Sacramento State. After I graduated, I packed up my car, drove out. It was in 2007. Drove out to New Hampshire to work on the New Hampshire primary for the then Senator Barack Obama. This is before he was even, a leading candidate. This is when Hillary was supposed to take it. Everybody kind of remember that? I think you were all children at the time. But this is the year that he was, or she was supposed to take it. We won in Iowa. We had a ton of momentum going into New Hampshire, and we were like, rah, 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 New Hampshire, and we lost by 2.5 points. And if you know anything about New Hampshire, which, by the way, should not have the same prominence in democracy as, say, California, but it's the smallest state ever, by the way. It's so small and rural. But they have this giant primary, but 2.5% is essentially we didn't knock on 10,000 doors. That's about it. And to a campaign of that size and that grassroots, it hurt a lot and gave us a lot of momentum. I dropped out of the campaign after that point because campaigning wasn't really my deal. It's a different animal. It's a much different type of political machine. And I wanted to get into policy. So I came back to sunny California because New Hampshire sucks. That weather's so cold. It's I'm telling you, in the month of December alone, when I was there and we were knocking on doors, and this is before I ended up being on the communications team out in New Hampshire, so I was still knocking on doors, and it snowed 55 inches in the month of December. 55, that's like more than a foot a week, and I hated it. I was born and raised California. I'm digging my car out, cussing the entire morning, just like, I hate this. But eventually, they put me on the comms team, and I had a sweet job on the communications team. They called it a tracker. Does anybody know what a tracker is? Who knows what a tracker is? Nobody does? All right, so this is what we call campaign espionage, right? Every single campaign has at least 4 or 5 people on their campaign. Their sole job is to follow opposition candidates around and record everything that they do. Everything. Does everybody remember Macaca? That whole thing? Virginia Senate race? There was a senator, or he was the incumbent. He was running for re-election. He was talking to a crowd, and he said, oh, yeah, I'm trying to be honest with you, but I have this guy over here, whatever his name, Macaca. And he said that, and that individual happened to be Indian, right? And it was all over the news, and he was being called a racist, and essentially he lost that race because of that one comment. And since then, trackers have been a little bit more prominent in the news, but they're still kind of underground. And what I did was I had to follow Hillary and Bill Clinton around most of New Hampshire and record them. And that was always weird because the Secret Service always kept looking at me because I was at every single event, sitting there really intently, like listening to people, right? If you've never dealt with the Secret Service, they're good guys. And then, okay, I came back to California. I'll finish this story real quick. And essentially, I got into policy. I got a job as a legislative aide in the Capitol. Those of you who want to work in the Capitol, as a junior aide, you get paid $30,000 a year, just so you know. Okay, they work you like a dog. And you get paid $30,000 a year, but there's no opportunity like working in the Capitol, either in Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., or in Sacramento, because you're going to be on the inside, you're going to be building connections that'll help you get a job further in the political field. Or if you don't want to work in the political field and you want to work in the business field, there's plenty of business folks that are lobbying the Capitol, and you could probably network with them. Not being able to live off of $30,000 a year for very long, I eventually sold out. And I moved over to a lobbying firm, Conservation Strategy Group, which is an environmental lobbying firm. So if you're an environmentalist, then you should be on my side. And they essentially offered me twice as much to do the same exact thing I was doing in the Capitol. Okay, yeah, sweet. Sign me up, right? So I did that. Of course, they worked me like a dog too. I was spending nights in the office and this is the time when we also were having a budget crisis where they were doing like 3 a.m., 4 a.m. budget votes, and it was just ridiculous. And so I eventually left there and wanted to get into nonprofit lobbying because that's really where my passion was. Alan brought up the fact, or Professor Ross, I don't know what they call you, this guy over here who was in charge. He says that next week you're going to talk to a former lobbyist. I am currently a lobbyist. I just lobby for reform groups, and that's really where I've made a name for myself, is in government reform. Now, why is government reform so important? Because we all know the famous words that, that this union is only perfect to a certain extent, right? A more perfect union. That's the words I was looking for. Everybody knows those 3 words, more perfect union? So that essentially means our governments can only get better, right? This is the best form of government that we can come up with at the current time. And I think all of you look at the government and say, really? This is the best form of government you come up with? And that's where reform groups like Common Cause and California Forward really come in, because we look at ways to transform the government and make it either more accountable to you or just work better in general. Now, what we do at California Forward is we make sure that there is utmost accountability in government programs. You'd be amazed by how many government programs get budget allocations and don't measure performance, don't measure their performance at all. It's literally, here's hundreds of millions of dollars, go and spend it, and essentially don't report back anything to us. And then next budget cycle comes, and the legislature asks the department, so what'd you do with the money? It's like, we spent it. Great, here's another $100 million, right? And so a big thing that California Forward works on is making sure that not only are performance measures taken by the departments, but that budget decisions are made based on these performance measures, because we want to get the biggest bang out of the buck, biggest bang out of the taxpayer dollar, right? Because I don't know anybody, conservative, liberal, Democrat, Republican, who likes wasting taxpayer dollars. Anybody in here likes wasting taxpayer dollars? Raise your hand. One person right over there. Everybody see that? Well, you're a student, that's why. Just kidding. I'm kidding. But just to reflect some of the things that we work on is, in the last few years, as the budget has been being reformed through the deficit and trying to close these gaps, the legislature put performance measures on the CSUs and the UCs, okay? And essentially what they said is these are performance measures that you have to keep and you have to report back to the legislature. However, the legislature actually has no intent on making budget decisions based on these performance measures, which makes you wonder, why are they keeping track of this stuff, right? And this is where California Forward comes in and says you should probably keep track of those things. Along the more, that's just more of the fiscal stuff that we work on. In regards to the government structural reforms, we were big proponents, and I was a big proponent of term limits reform, which changed our old term limits, which was 6 years in the Assembly at the state level, 6 years in the Assembly, and 8 years in the Senate, to essentially just 12 years total that somebody can serve in the legislature. Now, it is less time over a lifetime. So in the old ones, you could serve 6 in the Assembly, 8 in the Senate. That's 14 years total. The new reform is 12 years over a lifetime, but you can serve 12 years in either house. That's it, right? It's much more simple. It's 12 years. And this will allow legislators to think more long-term rather than their next job, which is what they had always done. We also worked on redistricting reform, which moved redistricting away from the politicians and over to an independent commission. And of course, we worked on the top 2 primary, which you all will be facing or seeing come June, which is, well, unfortunately, I know how many days away that is. It's 110 days away, because that's what we do in Sacramento, is we count down to elections. And essentially, that's what I do. Now, I'm here to talk about money and politics, and I have an interesting perspective on money and politics. For 2.5 years while I was with Common Cause, I was probably the most aggressive watchdog of money and politics for the state of California. I pushed the Fair Political Practices Commission, which is the government agency who's supposed to be in charge of ethics, to adopt stricter rules and to enforce the rules currently on the books a lot stronger than they had been. I'm also the individual who signed the complaint that eventually exposed the $11 million campaign money funneling that occurred in November 2012. Does everybody remember this? In regards to the Proposition 32 and Proposition 30 race, there was one nonprofit out of Arizona called Americans for Responsible Leadership. Sounds great, right? Yeah. They dropped $11 million into a California ballot measure race. okay, just out of nowhere, $11 million. This is a nonprofit that had never shown any interest in California politics until this $11 million contribution. And in fact, only mentioned California once on their website. But suddenly, and up until that $11 million contribution, only spent $500,000 in their entire lifetime. So suddenly, this mysterious nonprofit shows up with $11 million. That raised a lot of alarms for watchdog groups like myself. And so we filed the complaint, they looked into it, and they eventually figured out that this money was funneled between 3 nonprofits, and no, we still don't know who the donors are. So it came from one nonprofit in Virginia, was funneled to a nonprofit in Arizona, funneled to another nonprofit in Arizona, landed in California, and then on your TV screens. And for the most part, that was legal. And so we called it out anyways because the transfer of money was legal, but the non-disclosure of the donors was what was illegal, and that's what we eventually pegged them on, and we got about a $500,000 fine out of it, which is a victory for watchdog groups. And I pushed aggressively while I was in the state capitol and lobbying for Common Cause for new rules and regulations related to money in politics, because for the most part, all of you out here hate money in politics, right? It's dirty, it's gross, it corrupts. What other words do you guys think of when you think of money in politics? Shout them out. Slimy? Okay. What else? What was that? Effective. Slimy and effective. I'll take both of them. Anything else? What was that? Plutocracy. All right. Two-faced? You guys aren't talking about me, right? I just want to make sure that. All right. Yeah. As you can tell, there are different perspectives on money in politics. And I would say mine has shifted a little bit since I've left Common Cause. Now, I'm not big on deregulation, but I'm also a little bit more educated on the effects of regulation on money in politics. Now, this individual over here, I don't want to put you up, but somebody over here said that money in politics is effective. I would agree. In that one of the only reasons that voters like you come out and vote is because you feel like that election matters to you, right? Am I right? And the only way you feel elections matter to you is because the commercials tell you it matters to you. The mail that you get tells you it matters to you, right? And you feel like you need to participate because somebody's a socialist or somebody's a fascist and they're going to be elected. And so you feel like, okay, I need to get out there and I need to participate. Now, TV ads, radio ads, and mail cost money, right? And not just the actual printing and the showing of these ads, but somebody is an ad maker who gets paid to do this stuff, right? Somebody's a consultant, somebody's a pollster that polled, and somebody to poll to see if that message works for an audience like you. And somebody's also a data geek who keeps track of voter registration data and knows which targets are going on in what districts, right? All of that costs money to run a sophisticated campaign that will attract voters like you to the voting booth. And I think some of you are shaking your head thinking, wow, this guy has really switched on us, right? Let me finish. Another thing, not only are campaigns expensive, but regulation in any industry, and that's what politics has become. It has become an industry. So let me get this out of the way. So let me just stop, get one tangent, and a little bit of a rant out of the way, which is, when I was with Common Cause, we at Common Cause had a very idealistic vision of what we think politics should be like, right? Very romanticized vision of politics, that commercials should be offered for free to any candidate who wants to run for office. Radio ads should be offered for free. Voters should just be engaged, right? Why do you need to show commercials? Voters would just be engaged. In fact, I think the theory was that voters are disengaged because they hate the money in politics, which part of that is true. What I've learned is that the political industry itself is an industry, right? It's not romanticized. It's a pragmatic. Thousands and thousands of people work for the industry. In fact, there's an entire city, which I just drove from, it's totally afloat because of politics. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry for us out there, okay? We spent $6 billion nationwide on the presidential and congressional elections, okay? Now, the reason I bring that up is because over-regulation in any business causes compliance with those regulations causes the price of elections and complying with those regulations to go up. Does everybody understand that? Right? Because you have to hire a lawyer to read through these regulations. It's the same argument that the big banks make. It's the same argument that oil companies make. The more regulations, the harder it is to do the business, the more the cost of business, and it raises the price for consumers. Unfortunately, the consumers are you. The consumers are the politicians who have to raise money to run ads. I've also learned in my time as a watchdog and post-watchdog is this thing, which is when you want to run for public office, one of the first things you're told to do is to get a lawyer. Now, if you are an ambitious, patriotic American and you want to run for office, the last thing you want to hear is you should get a lawyer, right? But that is essentially the reality that we have enacted through campaign finance reform. It is so complicated. Literally hundreds of pages of regulation and law have been adopted at the federal level and at the state level that regulates candidates, their campaigns, how money is raised, how money is spent, how money is raised. I said that again because there's a lot of those regulations. And so the way I look at it is we really need to take a pragmatic look at campaign finance reform and figure out what's actually working, what are things that were adopted that are essentially troublesome for everybody but were in reaction to an isolated incident, and really start to clean up campaign finance so people like you, students, who want to run for Berkeley City Council can run without having to hire a lawyer. And that's really where I am now, and I hope that that perspective of where I came from and where I am now can elicit some good conversation here. And I think I've reached 4:30, so I really do want to start taking questions from some of you about what it is that you care about. Feel free to attack me, call me two-faced, call me slimy, call me a flip-flopper, call me effective. But I do want to hear your opinions. Or anything you need me to clarify? Yes. Yeah, well, the question, for the sake of the podcast, the question was, can I name other countries that have stronger campaign finance reform laws than America's, and, right? Is that the question? And lower poll attendance. Well, I would say that America's democracy is very different from the parliamentary elections that they have in other countries. We, by far, have the longest elections in the world, right? We're already talking about Hillary 2016. Okay, we just finished an election, and we're already talking about Hillary 2016 and who's going to be in the 2016 ticket. And that's different from parliamentary procedure or parliamentary elections because they don't start talking about elections until 3 months before the election, which I wish that was the case here, but then I'd be out of business. But there are other countries that have stronger campaign finance rules in regards to what kind of ads can be run, how you raise money, that type of stuff. And mostly because they don't have as strong as a constitution as we do, and they don't have a Supreme Court that really protects the liberties of voters here in America like we do. A lot of the deregulation that has occurred lately in America in regards to campaign finance is due to not Congress, but to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has really gutted campaign finance reform and left us in kind of the reality that we're in now. There's really only two options to fix that, which is to wait for a new Supreme Court where the majorities are switched, and then you can take the risk and rehear these cases, or you can pass a constitutional amendment. Both take a very, very, very long time. But there are other countries that have stricter rules, but their speech protections, their free speech protections are very different in their constitution than ours. Hope that answers your question. No, yes? The bullet train debacle. Somebody got the messaging memo on that one. the question was, has my group, California Forward, looked at the high-speed rail or the bullet train issue that's currently taking place in Sacramento? We have looked at it a little bit. I'm about to use a pun, but because it's kind of a third rail in California politics, we never had a dog in the fight in the first place. We didn't really want to step into it and be like, look at us, we got a position, take your shot, right? Our group does stress the importance of modernizing our infrastructure, though. And mostly because you all aren't thinking this far out, and if you are, good for you. But in the policy world, we're thinking, is California ready for the growing population? In 2050, there's supposed to be 50 million Californians, right? And are universities ready to take that many students? Are roads ready? You know, what is it that we need to do to not only maintain infrastructure, but modernize infrastructure to deal with that growing population? No other state is facing this because no other state is growing at the rate that we are. But, you know, is high-speed rail a solution? We don't really know. Yeah, let's go over here. Yeah. Good. The question was, has my group, either California Forward or Common Cause, my prior group, ever looked at public financing of campaigns? And the answer is yes. In fact, Common Cause is a huge proponent of public financing campaigns. Those of you who don't know what public financing of campaigns and what a program like that entails, right now all campaigns are privately financed. You as a candidate go and you call either your neighbor or your aunt or a giant corporation and you ask for money. Privately financed, okay? Publicly financed campaigns are when you raise a little bit of money and the state matches it with taxpayer money, all right? It's supposed to, in theory, lower corruption, make candidates more accountable to voters because you're spending taxpayer money. And also supposed to give this financial support to challengers who are running against an incumbent who has all the infrastructure and all of the fundraising already lined up and ready to go. Did I get that right? I think so, because I worked in this. We have looked into it. I'll tell you my personal opinion, which is when I talk about public financing with my campaign consultants friends, they love it. That's the first sign of something scary, when campaign consultants love something, right? Because and this is where I got kind of not anti-public financing, but I got a little cautious towards public financing. Because when I talk to my campaign consultant friends, nothing makes them more excited than a constant stream of income, right? Because campaign seasons, for the most part, if you're a campaign consultant, you're working like every 2-year cycles, right? And the income's kind of inconsistent. And sometimes clients aren't always there, and you won't get hired onto a team. With public financing, almost anybody can run on public financing, get taxpayer dollars, and consultants love it. And so that's something that really turned me off because if it's a consultant, you know, I don't know, TARP plan, right, where you're just dumping money in the consultancy industry, it's kind of I think it turns voters off as well. Yeah, go ahead, follow up. Would public financing lower the cost of regulations? I would say no, because you can't get rid of privately financed campaigns. Those campaigns will still exist. They have a constitutional right to exist, right? What public financing will do will lower the cost of campaigns for those who are publicly financed, absolutely. Because essentially, you're not fundraising as much, right? And the money's coming from the government. Yeah. So if you're a publicly financed campaign, you still probably need a lawyer, though, to work through the system. Yeah.
How effective do you think it's been? How many states currently have public financing? 3 or 4?
3 or 4 states, yeah, have public financing.
Has it been effective, do you think, in those states?
I think it's hard to tell at this point because they're still relatively new public financing programs, especially since they've been adjusted to the Supreme Court decisions as it relates to public financing. I don't know if you get any different results from elections, though.
Well, it seems to me a lot of people were elected that never would have had a chance without public financing.
I think that's probably right. Yeah, I think Professor Ross is right that folks have been elected under public financing that usually wouldn't under California's privately financed system. Yeah.
Thank you.
would mandatory voting, compulsory voting, like on Australia, right? Australia has compulsory voting. Would that lower the cost of campaigns? I actually think it would raise the cost of campaigns, because if you know everybody's voting, you have to market to a lot more people than the likely voter. Does that make sense? You don't have to spend money on get out the vote efforts or GOTV, but you do have to spend money on still flyers, radio ads, and get that across. Compulsory voting also raises the chance of rioting, because Americans hate being told that they have to go and vote. I think somebody in Sacramento brought up compulsory voting once, and I don't think they've ever been seen again. Because it's just not a very popular idea among Americans that one of their rights, that they have to exercise one of their rights. Yeah. Right. That's a couple of questions. I'm going to try to repeat that for the podcast. He's asking about fiscal reforms and performance measures that we were talking about in the budget, especially in the CSU and UC system, and how regulation may stifle research at universities like UC Berkeley. Did I get that right? Well, we're not putting regulations on whether or not you can do research, right? Or whether or not you should follow a source of study. I'm sorry? Performance measures aren't more restrictions. You're just keeping track of what the results of those measures are. My understanding is that at the UC system, the vast majority of your research is privately financed, though. And so the performance measures from a taxpayer standpoint really doesn't matter when it comes to research if it's privately funded. Those privately funded foundations and grants all have their own performance measures. Otherwise, they're just wasting money as well. But they want to see results from the research that you guys are doing here at Berkeley, as far as I know. But performance measures have nothing to do with whether or not you should conduct research or not. It's more along the lines of how many students are we actually graduating, right? How many students are we actually taking in? How many students are actually dropping out? Those types of performance measures. Which classes are actually filling up? Which classes aren't? Yeah. So let's go. Wait, somebody have a question? Yeah. There. You answered your question? Okay. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, the questions regarding the top two primary, the open primary. Yeah, absolutely. So an open primary, I'll get back to your question. An open primary, it's better if I explain what a closed primary is, because I think they're used to that. A closed primary essentially means if you're registered as a Democrat or registered as a Republican, you can only vote during that primary for a Democratic candidate or Republican candidate. An open primary gets rid of that wall and says if you're a Democrat, you can vote for a Republican that's on the ballot or a Democrat that's on the ballot, okay? And so it's totally open, and at least the theoretical goal of an open primary is to moderate candidates, because they're trying to appeal to both sides and get as many votes versus appealing to the base, which is really who turns out during primaries. Now his question was, can I talk a little bit? Yes.
In the old system, after the primaries, the winner of the Democrats runs against the winner of the Republicans.
That's right.
Under the new system, the top two will run against each other.
That's right.
So in many districts, it'll be Democrat against Democrat. Say Berkeley, I mean, the first 36 Democrats would still beat the next Republican. All right? So a Republican cannot be in the top two. It's in the Bible, I think.
Yeah, I think so. in the Berkeley Bible somewhere, yeah.
Shall not have a Republican.
That's right.
So anyway, it'll be the top two of the voting, regardless of party.
Yeah, and we've only been working on this system for a couple of elections. We had one cycle so far, and we saw an incredibly expensive race down in Los Angeles, the Berman-Sherman race, where these two incumbent congressmen were drawn into the same district, and they essentially spent millions of dollars killing each other, and one of them eventually...
They almost fought.
And they almost literally fought at a debate one time. It was actually quite funny. But he wanted me to... They're really old guys, and one was hugging him too hard, and he was like, "Don't hug me," and they're both like, you know, old, angry, like Jewish men who've been in Congress a really long time. So his question was, can I talk about the mixed bag that is open primary? It is quite a mixed bag. I think I think folks are still trying to figure out whether or not it has been effective in meeting the goals that were proposed when it was originally passed in 2010, right? Yeah, in 2010. It depends on kind of what perspective you're looking at. If you're talking about voter turnout, I don't think you've seen voter turnout increase solely because of top two. And it's hard to really just isolate academically, whether or not top two was the reason for an increased turnout or a lowering of turnout. In regards to money in politics, I think we're actually seeing that the top two primary has caused an increase in money in politics. Because what you have is a Berman-Sherman race where you have two Democrats spending millions of dollars against each other rather than just taking a primary and then spending the millions of dollars on a Republican. Or in the case of Berman-Sherman where they faced each other twice. They faced each other in a primary where they killed each other, and then they faced each other again in a general election because they both placed top two, right? And they killed each other again in the general election. And we're seeing that in a whole host of races. I think there's one happening in Oakland now where there's 4 Democrats running. And they're really going after each other as well. We'll see that what was that?
In Berkeley.
And we're seeing that in Berkeley. I think you'll see that really we'll see what the reform looks like at a statewide level because you have 6 Secretary of State candidates currently running. You have 3 Democrats, a Republican, and a no party preference, which Dan Schnur, I think, teaches here, or used to teach here. And he'll be speaking here in a few weeks, so grill him with questions. And one of the goals that people had said could happen with open primaries is a no party candidate, somebody who was unregistered to a party could be elected to office. We've yet to see that happen, so we don't know if that is a claim that could be made true, right? And we don't know if it's because of the party or because of the candidate. There's a whole host of different issues. And so it is a mixed bag, and I would just quickly say that there's just not enough data yet to draw a conclusion. Any other questions? Yes? That's a much more complicated question. We have an education person that works in our office who could probably answer that question, but I'm just the talking head, so I don't really dive into the issues that deeply. But performance measures as it relates to education is a difficult one because I think that's probably the hardest thing about education policy is it's hard to track results, right? You essentially have to track every kid from pre-K all the way until they either graduate from college or enter the workforce to figure out whether or not a curriculum has been effective or a system has been effective. And it's just beyond me to answer that question, so I'll just stop there. Yeah?
On the topic of private campaign expenditures, on the national level, there's been a lot of, I guess it's kind of a liberal sentiment that Citizens United is kind of bad for politics in general.
Yeah.
How would you, I don't know, what's the main point against, the best way to attack Citizens United? If we were seriously talking about repealing it, how would you go about making a case against it?
Making a case against repealing it or making a case against Citizens United? Okay. His question is regarding to Citizens United and what's the best case I could make against Citizens United, right? Yeah, Citizens United was a court case that was in front of the Supreme Court in 2010, and essentially what it did was threw out almost a decade-old ban on corporate and union independent expenditures. Now, what an independent expenditure is, this is where we're going to take a deep dive into campaign finance, so hold on. Independent expenditures are when an organization, either a PAC or a corporation, spends money for or against the candidate without coordinating with that candidate at all. So it's independent. They're not talking to them, they're not strategizing. Corporation so-and-so just doesn't like Philip Hung. And so they're just running ads against me without coordinating with my opponent. The Supreme Court ruled that you can't ban that type of communication because it's considered speech. And you're banning speech or you're prohibiting speech, and that's against the First Amendment. And so they threw out the regulation or the rule, the ban, And so now corporations and unions and nonprofits can spend unlimited amounts against or for a candidate pretty much without limit, as long as they're not coordinating. I think I got that right. I'm pretty sure I did. And he wants to know what's a good argument against Citizens United. And a good argument against Citizens United is that even though it's independent, it's still corrupting. Expenditures against a candidate still has a way of influencing a candidate. Even the threat of an independent expenditure, if a corporation or a union even threatens, like leaks a press release or a strategy memo that they are going to run $10 million against a Senate candidate in Kentucky, that's going to change the attitude of that Kentucky senator, right? Or that California congressman. And so that's the best argument I have about why Citizens United is bad. Also, it has increased the amount of money spent in politics because now now folks can spend as much as they want outside of a candidate versus if they spent it through a candidate, they're capped at a contribution limit. Yes. Follow up. Yes. Yeah. Meg Whitman is an outlier. Meg Whitman, as far as I know, was the biggest disaster in California politics, where she spent $140 million of her own money and lost to a guy who spent $40 million. And the question was, is there an effect on how much money a candidate spends on their chances of re-election or chances of election? Right. There's a pretty good amount of data out there that shows if a candidate spends more money than their opponent, and effectively spends their money more than their opponent, they have about an 80 or 90% chance of being elected. So it's pretty high. If you raise more money, it's a pretty good prediction that you're going to be elected. Now, does that mean that money equals, you're guaranteed an office? You pointed out Meg Whitman. Absolutely not. There's plenty of other candidates we can name where that's not true. Some people say it's because the reason that candidate is getting the most money because that person's just a good candidate, right? The person's just a good candidate. The person should be in office, so people are throwing their support at that person. And it's hard to tell, really. So it's not just the money, too. Like I said, you have to use it effectively. You have to communicate to voters. Otherwise, if you're just spending a ton of money on consultants, what's the point, right? No problem. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, the question is regards to independent redistricting, which we adopted and went through the first cycle in 2010. We'll go through it again in 2020, which is really close. It's actually unbelievable that it's that close. And whether or not that increased, because we drew Berman and Sherman, for example, into the same district, if that increased the amount of money in politics. Now, when that happened, that was, for the most part, a oneer, right? It was one time because those folks were in separate districts, and then they were drawn into a same district. After a couple of election cycles, folks start to settle into their new districts, and you don't run into that two incumbents facing each other incident. And so after independent redistricting, you do see an occasional spike in spending because you have incumbents trying to fight for their life to keep their job. But afterwards, I think it settles down a little bit. So come 2020, when we redraw lines again, you'll see it happen again. I can almost guarantee it. Yeah. That's right. The question is there any evidence that independent expenditures are coordinating with the campaign indirectly? And I would say, yes, there is evidence of that. If you've watched The Daily Show and Colbert Report, I think they pretty much prove that coordination between independent expenditures and campaigns is totally possible without being direct. And one of the ways they do that is Colbert had his Colbert Super PAC, right? For a better tomorrow type of thing. And And he put in, because he was running for Congress in South Carolina, or running for president actually in South Carolina, he couldn't be in charge of a super PAC. So he handed over the reins to a super PAC to Jon Stewart, right? And essentially what Stephen Colbert did was he went on TV and said, you know, I hope that this super PAC spends money this way. And Jon Stewart, watching TV, goes, okay, we'll spend money that way, right? And it's totally indirect, right? They're not coordinating, like having strategy meetings, but they might as well be having strategy meetings, right? And this isn't just, you know, on parody shows, but this, and it's not just with conservatives, it happens with liberal groups as well. And you know, what's happening with super PACs is actually really odd and ironic, because one of the biggest super PACs operating right now is Ready for Hillary, right? Which, if you know anything about campaign finance reform, is incredibly ironic, because Citizens United was because of a anti-Hillary film, right? And now she is trying to be drafted, I guess, by one of the largest liberal super PACs currently in existence. They've raised tens of millions of dollars. And you know, so this is not a tool that is only being used by conservatives, it's being used by everybody at this point, because if it's in the tool shed, I think campaigns are saying, why not use it? To answer your question? I did, right? Yeah. Any hands? Did I scare them off? Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead. Sweatshirt.
Oh, sweatshirt. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, well, I focused a lot on my past job because and he asked whether I can just discuss what I'm currently doing now, because you all wanted to hear about money in politics, and so that's what I did in my past life, in my past job. Over the last month and a half that I've been working at California Forward, I'm that new. I'm the director of public affairs, so I essentially just do political strategy for them. For a long time, California Forward has been viewed as a think tank, and essentially has been, that's a pretty accurate description of what they were prior to me coming on, is a think tank who thought up a lot of great ideas on how to reform government, but didn't really take those ideas and turn them into any pieces of legislation or anything politically viable. So they hired me to be their strategist and their voice in the Capitol.
Take interns at all then?
Do I take interns? No, not this year. I would say keep in touch, though. You can find me on Twitter. Mm-hmm. Or California Forward, yeah. Or names like California Forward, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. Well, I mean, we're still a think tank. They just hired a lobbyist, so that's the difference. You know, I think it's important to see where the funding comes from the think tanks. We got all of our funding from the 5 biggest foundations in the state. So we're not pushed by any one ideology. We're really just trying to get the best results out of government. I think most think tanks will think that as well. It is a new strategy that we're seeing, think tanks being funded by ideologically driven groups to produce ideologically driven studies, right, or tilted studies. It's a new thing using think tanks, but creating ideologically tilted studies is not a new thing, right? It's just a new way of putting lipstick on a pig. And so I guess that's my answer to your question is it's not new, it's just a new type of activity, yeah. But just be really careful when you're reading any type of, you know, report from a think tank that you either know where their source is or you kind of know where they lean ideologically. Like I think everybody knows at this point Heritage is a right-leaning group, right? And so that's just one example. And Rand is another one. Reason is another one. So there's plenty out there. And the liberal groups have their set of groups also. I think we have only four more minutes. How would what financial reform? Oh, how would campaign finance reform affect bipartisanship? Well, for the most part, campaign finance reform has, I don't know if it has any effect on partisanship, other than parties really band together to raise as much money as possible. They're fighting for the same donors. I can say that. And when Shadi's here, she'll tell you that she got phone calls from Democrats and liberals, or Democrats and Republicans, looking for a check from Chevron. When you are running for office or you're a political party and it takes hundreds of millions of dollars to run an election and there's only so many donors, you hit them up. And it's kind of the world that we live in now.
What do you think of the effects of California being a one-party state right now?
What do I think about the effects of California being a one-party state? It has been interesting in Sacramento. Well, California, for the most part, has always been a one-party state, but you mean a one-party governed state, right?
Why has it always been a one-party state?
Well, the Democrats have been in charge of the legislature for almost 40 years now.
Republican governors.
We've had a lot of Republican governors, that's true. Okay, so I'll take that back, Professor Ross. But currently in Sacramento, it's different because things are much more efficient now. There's nobody really standing in the way of the Democrats' agenda, and so they've kind of just been able to get whatever they want through. But being a one-party ruled state is also odd in that they are being very careful about what they do because they want to try to keep their power as long as possible. And so the nightmare scenario laid out of tax increases and lowering tax voting thresholds and constitutional amendments galore just hasn't really come to fruition because I think the Democrats are just, again, trying to be pragmatic about the way that they govern and keep their office. It also helps having Jerry Brown be the old crotchety, stingy guy in the horseshoe. He really doesn't want to spend any money, and he's been really successful at getting his party in line in the legislature, and they have reluctantly done so.
And what main change or changes do you think, if you could implement, would really help Sacramento, California government? What do you see as the biggest problems in government right now?
What do I see as the biggest problem in California state government? From my Common Cause perspective and also from my California Forward perspective, and I think it reflects onto all of you, is there's a huge lack of civic engagement in the state. That voters don't know what they're voting on ballot initiatives. In fact, when I talked to Mac Taylor, who's the legislative analyst, the guy who's actually in charge of the nonpartisan legislative analyst office, privately he tells me, and I could tell you because he doesn't care, is that when he reads ballot measures, he's lost also. This is like the wonkiest, nerdiest dude in Sacramento who runs the wonkiest, nerdiest agency in Sacramento, and he doesn't even know what he's reading in these ballot measures. And so that's just reflective of how complicated governance has gotten, and I think that has turned off a lot of people, in a lot of voters like you. But you shouldn't pull away from being participants in government. I mean, you should still contact your legislator, contact your city council member, because if you don't, interest groups like me, or lobbyists like me and my colleagues and my peers will fill the void. And I don't think that's what you want either, right? Hope not. Unless the void is filled by UCSA, right? There you go.
Thank you so much for coming out today.
Thank you, everybody.